girl came up to me with a pair of scissors and asked if she could cut a piece of my hair. And she first said that to me, I thought I had misunderstood, and I asked her again, and she said, yeah, I want to cut a piece of your hair to bring back to my grandma. She's never seen like yellow hair before. So I like cut her a little lock and I gave it to her without really thinking much of it. And then before I knew it, I had this swarm of like 8-year-olds jumping up and down around me being like, I want a piece, I want a piece. So I was just standing there like, here you go, here you go. My name is Clarinda. Would you want me to say my full name? My name's Clarinda Blais. I'm a writer and a filmmaker. And sometimes I tell people I'm a China hand. That doesn't mean something to everyone, but to some people it means something. But what it means is I'm someone who's spent a lot of time living and working in China, and I like to use that experience to help other people understand China a little bit better. Yeah.
So what sparked your interest in China?
It was honestly just, I grew up in a really small white working class town. So I didn't grow up in a very diverse city. And when I left home to go to college in Boston, I was really shocked by how many Chinese students there were and how little I knew about China. I knew nothing. I think I had vaguely heard of Mao Zedong before, and that was it. So we had a foreign language requirement. And I remember sitting in freshman orientation and seeing that the class sizes for Chinese were really small. It was an average of like 6 students per class. And I was like, well, that was attractive to me, having a lot of attention from a teacher. And I was simultaneously really curious about all the Chinese international students that I felt like I didn't know anything about. And they were very insular, like they really grouped together and kind of only talked to each other. So yeah, I was just a little bit curious. I really loved my Chinese teachers in college. They were all quite old, probably in their 70s or 80s. And they were very cute and very hardworking. And I remember one of my Chinese teachers, my first Chinese teacher, said to me, Clarinda, you're Chinese very bad, but you very hard worker, very hard worker. She would tell me that like almost every class, that my Chinese was very bad, but I was a very hard worker. And it got a little better eventually. It didn't get better until I lived there for a while.
I know you've taught class in Henan Province. It's a rural place compared to Shanghai.
Yeah.
So any different experiences there?
Yeah, and that's why I think about my time in Shanghai very little when I think about my experience and understanding of China, because it really was like a bubble of foreigners in a small pocket of Shanghai. But then I spent, like you said, a lot of time in a rural part of Henan Province, where every experience was just I experienced everything very deeply because everything was so different, and because I was the only foreigner around, and the only foreigner most people had seen. So when I first got to Henan on my first day there, I remember, I probably have told you this story, but like a little girl came up to me with a pair of scissors and asked if she could cut a piece of my hair to bring back to her grandma. And she first said that to me, I thought I had misunderstood, and I asked her again, and she said, yeah, I want to cut a piece of your hair to bring back to my grandma. She's never seen like yellow hair before. So I like cut her a little lock and I gave it to her without really thinking much of it. And then before I knew it, I had this swarm of like 8-year-olds jumping up and down around me being like, I want a piece, I want a piece. So I was just standing there like, here you go, here you go. But it was, I think that's kind of why my like interest in rural China developed, particularly because I grew up in such a small, homogenous town where I had only really ever seen and known other people who grew up in that town and looked like me and had the same customs as me. I really kind of identified with that little girl's, like, it's just curiosity about someone who looks weird, and different. So I thought it was really, really sweet. Yeah.
Okay, so you taught classes in Henan and were also a Schwarzman Scholar at Tsinghua University. So what differences did you notice between the education systems in China and the US?
Yeah, there's a big difference. And I noticed it at both levels I've experienced it, like at the primary education and then the secondary education when I was in Henan versus when I was at Schwarzman. And I think, I feel like the biggest difference in the US, and I didn't go to a very good like public school in the US, but in the US, I feel like we're taught to question things. You are in class with a teacher or a professor and you're encouraged to voice your opinion or to question the teacher's opinions and to have discussions. And I felt like in China, it's very much about listening to the professor or listening to the teacher, taking as many notes as you can and like learning all of that information, as much information as you can. And I think, I personally, as like a learner, respond to both kinds of education. And I think both kinds of education are really valuable and probably both could benefit from being a little bit more like the other. Like God knows in the US we could benefit from actually learning more. And I think the Chinese education system could probably better engage students if it incentivized like asking questions and engaging in discussion. At least when I was in like the elementary schools and the high schools, I felt like there just simply was too many students and not enough teachers to facilitate that kind of like classroom experience.
I'm curious about, were there any social norms in China that were hard for you to adjust to at first?
Timeliness and like scheduling. When I lived in Henan, I felt like it was very hard to make plans and to know what I was doing with my day. People would be like, oh, well, in the afternoon we'll go out for a meal. And I would be like, okay, well, what time? Afternoon. Or I would make plans for myself and then suddenly I would get invited to a meal and it would be very rude to decline. And there just wasn't this I just felt like there wasn't the same sort of commitment to structure of your day. And it also, I think American people tend to be a little bit more punctual. Like if we say 4 o'clock, for the most part, we'll be there at 4 o'clock or shortly thereafter. I think Chinese people have a much more like flexible sense of what 4 o'clock means. And I think that was it took me a really long time to get used to.
Have you noticed any surprising commonality between Chinese and American people, things that felt familiar or deeply human?
Yeah, there are probably so many stories like that, but when I read your questions, I read it more generally, and what I was thinking when you asked what is something I think Chinese people and American people have in common, I really like that we're all quite laid back. I think like Americans tend to be a little more punctual and Chinese people tend to pay more careful attention to details when they do their work. But I think in general, it's two cultures that really care about other people and the well-being of other people, and we don't take ourselves all that seriously. You can sit on the subway and you can eat a snack on the subway, or you can walk down the street and you can talk loudly with a friend and no one's going to look at you funny. But when you're in other countries like Japan or even Austria, I've experienced such they're kind of, this is probably a little offensive, but they're kind of like uptight cultures, and there are a lot of like social norms that are tacitly understood between each other, where you have to act and behave a certain way. And I feel like having lived both in the US and in China, I feel quite comfortable to just like relax and be myself in both places. So I really appreciate that. I think I don't know, it's tough because the things that make me realize how much we have in common are the things that all humans kind of have in common, which is that we want to do right by our moms and dads. We want to find the right husband and get married, and we're not sure if we want to have kids, but we somehow feel some pressure too. I had a good friend in Henan who was getting engaged around the time that I was there, and I remember her confiding in me a lot about the pressure that she felt from her family, and kind of also the sense that how when she got married, she understood it as sort of a transfer of ownership. So she was like no longer, I mean, owned is a strong word, but she was no longer belonged to her mother and father, but belonged to her fiance's mother and father. And I found that really kind of sad. But in the US, it's sort of the same idea. You know, the father gives away the bride walking down the aisle because he's turning you over to your husband. So you're no longer your parents anymore. And I think that's a really like sad and scary thing. And she was going through that, and I like totally got it. It didn't feel like it was I mean, there were elements of it that were culturally specific, but a lot of it just felt like it's hard to be a woman, and these are the trade-offs that we make and the calculations we have to do. Yeah.
So I'm curious about, was there anything that changed your mind after visiting China, something that you never imagined before?
I mean, I never imagined, and it sounds kind of silly, but Americans are very afraid of the word communism. I think that term conjures tons of really oppressive and like horrifying images in our imagination. So to go live in China, in like a communist country, I was quite surprised to find that day-to-day life felt safe and happy and normal. And it's 100% more complicated than that. And I think the longer I lived there, the more developed my sense of what it means to live in a communist country became. But right away, I was just very surprised to experience communism, be like, whoa, this isn't what they said it was, you know? Yeah.
Just about your thought on the debate over freedom between those two societies.
Yeah. Yes. It's really funny. This is something, actually, I went back to China. I don't know if I told you I was there for a Schwarzman conference on local policy making. I just got back like a little less than a week ago. And I was nervous going back because I left right before COVID. And then we had a whole global pandemic, and we've since elected Trump, and this did just so much tension around COVID-19 and the virus having come from China in the US, and then Trump's like really vitriol rhetoric about China and the trade war. I really felt like going back to China this time, I was going to be unwelcome as soon as people found out I was American. And I thought that they wouldn't even be curious about where I was from, just given the tension that seems to be brewing internationally. But when I got there, it was like nothing had changed. People in Beijing, and I was in Beijing, and so I was expecting people to be even less willing to talk to me. Every cafe I sat in, every park I sat in, somebody sat next to me and was like, so where are you from? And we had the same conversation that I'm used to having. And I was so relieved to find that people still wanted to talk to me. And when I told people that I was American, their first question was, how are things in Los Angeles? It looks really scary on the news. It wasn't so anyways, to answer your question, something that always comes up in those conversations that I have with people on the street who stop and ask where I'm from is they always ask me, do you feel like you're more free in China or in America? So like Chinese people are really thinking about this question in their own sense of freedom. And they always seem to think that China is the freest country in the world. And it's because you can get away with things like, you know, driving in the wrong lane on the other side of the street, just like stuff you couldn't do in the US, you can kind of get away with in China. And I think something that like Americans are finally coming to terms with now is that freedom is a little bit a part of our PR. It's sort of part of how we market our country, that we're free to express ourselves, free to chase our dreams, free to call out the government, protest, all of those things. And I think we're learning that we don't have those freedoms to the extent we thought we did. I mean, we're seeing things now where like the federal government is trying to control the curriculum in schools, right? We're seeing them remove statues that they feel should be removed. They're cutting funding for public news. So I don't think we're as free as we think we are. And I think Chinese people are freer than we give them credit for. But I do think like, I mean, if I'm being honest and not trying to measure what I say, I still do feel grateful to be an American, particularly in my line of work, because I do still feel like I will be safe to explore, just as a filmmaker, I'm safe to explore the things that I want to explore openly and to share them with an audience. I don't know if I would feel that way if I was a Chinese citizen.
I don't think you will do that.
And I don't even feel that way being a filmmaker who's lived and worked in China wanting to make films about China. It makes me very nervous. And so like, I do think America's freer. I don't think we're as free as we think we are. But I also don't think Chinese people are as oppressed as Americans like to think they are.
So last question is, how have your cross-cultural experiences shaped you? Or maybe how did they lead to you pursue filmmaking?
Yeah, it's hard to know. How do I say this? It's hard to know if I was drawn to China because of like something in my personality. I'm not the kind of person who makes a lot of assumptions. I'm a little stupid in that way. Like, I really had no preconceived ideas about what China would be before I went. I wasn't really scared of anything. I wasn't really particularly excited about anything either. I was just kind of like, yeah, let's go to China. And so, yeah, it's hard to know if I had a different kind of personality if I just would have never gone in the first place, you know. But I think having lived there for as long as I did and having to sort of form really deep cross-cultural relationships with people, which, by the way, is really hard to do. Making like close relationships with someone who grew up in a completely different world than you did isn't easy. Like I think it's much easier to sort of say, oh, well, we're different in that way, so we won't touch those subjects, or oh, we're different in that way, so we'll just keep going our separate ways, you know, without having to do the hard work of like actually learning to appreciate someone else's point of view. And I had to do a lot of that hard work in China, and I'm really grateful for it because I feel like I feel like we've gotten to a point in the US particularly, and I think it's a broader phenomena, I'm sure, but I think we've gotten to the point in the US where we find it really difficult to listen to one another and to imagine that somebody with a different opinion could be equally justified, or be coming from the same place but has taken a different route. I think in the US it's really easy for us to just sort of write off the people we disagree with now. We're in one camp or we're in the other. And I feel like because of the time that I spent in China trying to really I fell in love with so many people, romantically and platonically, you know? And in order to do that, I really had to learn how to listen, and I really had to learn how to put myself in somebody else's shoes. And I think that skill is invaluable. And I think it makes me a better person, and I want more people to be able to experience that. It's a cliche, but just to be able to experience stepping into someone else's shoes and looking at the world the way they see it. And that's what makes me want to make movies, because I feel like you can do that through film. You can show someone the world through any given perspective, and they can really learn to empathize with that perspective.